The IGE stands for the intergenerational elasticity, and it comes out of a regression of the log of kids' income when they're adults on their parents' income. And it basically measures how much of the gap in income between families persists from one generation to the next. The simple way to think about it is that the IGE tells us about the fraction of the gaps in income between families that'll remain a generation later. So for example, if you took two families and the gap in income between them was 50% in one generation, if the IGE was 0.6, then it would suggest that about 60% of that 50% gap would remain a generation later, or that the gap would still be a pretty large 30%, even a generation later. On the other hand, if the IGE was just 0.1, that would tell you that only a small portion of that 50% gap would remain a generation later. The gap between these two families would just be 5%. This is a good measure of opportunity because it tells us if gaps between families are closing pretty rapidly within a generation, then it suggests there's probably a reasonable degree of opportunity in society. Whereas if these gaps are not closing very much, then there's probably some impediment to opportunity. The IGE should be interpreted as a measure of relative mobility and not absolute mobility. So even if the economy is growing really rapidly and everyone's doing better than their parents did in absolute terms, in dollar terms, it could still be that the gaps in society are still very large. And that's how we should think about what the IGE is capturing. It's those relative gaps between families. I would put the IGE in the US at about 0.6 or perhaps higher, but at a minimum, I think the consensus view is that it's about 0.5 or higher. At the end of the day, the IGE is really just a descriptive measure. It's not a normative measure where a higher number is necessarily worse and a lower number is necessarily better. For example, if the IGE was 0, it would suggest that parents really have no way to influence the trajectory of their kids. And that's probably not an IGE that most people in society would want. On the other hand, an IGE that's quite high, like it appears to be in the US, is probably highly suggestive that there's some lack of opportunity and some inability for people to move up and down the income distribution. So an IGE of 0.6, as we have in the US, means that we have the highest IGE amongst the OECD countries, suggesting that we're the least mobile. You can compare this to countries like Denmark and Norway or Australia that have IGEs of about 0.2, putting them at the other end of the spectrum as among the most mobile countries in the OECD.